All right, so today we're diving deep into Spanish politics and migration.
Sounds complicated.
It is, and we've got some fascinating articles from RTVE and El País to help us unpack it all,
All in Spanish, of course.
naturally. But don't worry, we'll break it all down for you. What really jumps out at you from these articles? What's the main takeaway?
Well, I think the biggest thing is just how much Spain's internal politics are affecting how they deal with the whole European migration situation.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to solve a puzzle, but the pieces keep changing shape, right?
Exactly. And a perfect example of that is this new agreement they have about distributing those unaccompanied migrant minors across Spain.
Right, the deal between the PSOE, the ruling Socialist Party, and Junts, the Catalan separatist party.
It's supposed to help ease the pressure on the Canary Islands. They're like a major arrival point for these kids.
But it's causing a lot of controversy.
Yeah, for sure.
One thing that really stood out to me was that Catalonia only agreed to take in like 20 to 30 minors out of the 4,000 who need to be relocated.
Yeah, that's a tiny number when you think about it.
It seems almost symbolic.
It could be Junts just trying to use their leverage to get more from the PSOE.
You know, playing politics.
Exactly. The government's in a pretty weak position right now, so Junts might be taking advantage of that.
But maybe there are also practical reasons, you know, like logistical stuff or infrastructure limits that we don't know about.
Yeah, it's probably a mix of both.
Let's talk about the backlash to this deal, though, because it's been pretty intense.
It has. The People's Party, the PP, they're really using this to attack the PSOE.
Yeah, they're saying that the PSOE are putting politics before the well-being of these kids.
And some of the PP-led regional governments are even threatening to sue to stop the transfers.
Valencia, for example, they've just straight up refused to take any more migrants.
They say they're already overwhelmed.
So is that genuine concern or just political posturing?
Probably both.
Mm-hmm.
The PP sees this as a chance to make the PSOE look bad and, capitalize on people's anxieties about migration.
Right, make them look weak and incompetent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you can't deny that many regions are struggling to provide enough housing, education, and healthcare for a sudden influx of people.
It's a tough situation all around.
It is. So the PSOE is kind of stuck. They need Junts to pass laws, but if they give Junts what they want, it's going to make other regions mad and give the PP more ammunition to attack them with.
And then to make things even more complicated, there's ERC.
Right, the other Catalan separatist party.
Their leader, Oriol Junqueras, he's threatening to block the 2026 national budget if the PSOE don't keep their promises to ERC.
So the PSOE have got to keep both Junts and ERC happy, which is not an easy task.
It's like walking a tightrope.
Exactly. And all this while they're trying to deal with this complex and sensitive issue of migration.
What do you think could happen if they get it wrong? What are the stakes here?
Well, the first thing is probably legislative gridlock. If they lose the support of either Junts or ERC, they won't be able to pass any new laws.
So nothing gets done.
Right. And that'll make them look even weaker and less stable.
And probably damage public trust even more. But let's not forget about the human cost here, too.
Oh, absolutely.
These political battles are having a real impact on the lives of these unaccompanied minors.
They're the ones caught in the middle.
What happens to them if the government can't agree on a plan for their care and integration?
It's a good question, and one that doesn't get asked enough, I think. These kids are incredibly vulnerable.
They've already been through so much.
They need stability and support to have a chance at a good future. But that's hard to provide when everything's in chaos.
It's a sobering thought. All right, so we've got political maneuvering, regional tensions, the plight of these vulnerable children. And, of course, this wouldn't be a deep dive into Spanish politics without mentioning Pablo Echenique.
Ah, yes, the former Podemos leader.
And that controversial tweet of his.
The one comparing the likelihood of priests abusing children versus migrants doing it.
Right. He sparked a huge debate about free speech and how far public figures can go.
Well, it wasn't just a comparison. He actually argued that, statistically speaking, deporting priests would be more effective for public safety than tightening immigration.
And that's what's landed him in court.
He's facing trial for hate speech.
Which is interesting because the prosecutor actually wanted to drop the case.
Yeah, but the judge decided to go ahead with the trial.
It seems like they're saying that even though he used statistics, what he said could still be seen as inciting discrimination against the Catholic Church.
Because of his position and influence?
So it's not just about what he said, but also about who he is and how many people might listen to him.
Exactly. It's a really tricky issue, this whole question of hate speech online.
Where do you draw the line between free speech and harmful rhetoric?
Right. And this case could set a precedent for how online speech is regulated in Spain.
It feels like a turning point in the whole debate.
I think so, too.
Okay, so we've got political battles, legal battles, and a whole lot of tension. But it's not all doom and gloom in Spain, right?
No, not at all. The tourism industry is booming,
That's right. International arrivals are way up compared to last year.
especially from Italy, China, and those Gulf countries.
It's a great boost for the Spanish economy, but it does raise some questions too.
Like, how will this influx of tourists affect resources and infrastructure?
Especially in areas that are already struggling with the challenges of absorbing migrants.
Right. More people means more demand for everything.
So how do you balance economic prosperity with responsible resource management?
It's a tightrope walk for sure.
Okay, so to sum up, we've got political maneuvering migration challenges, a heated free speech debate, and a booming tourism industry all happening at the same time.
And they're all connected in some way.
Exactly. They all influence each other. It's fascinating, but also very complicated.
Definitely. So what are your main takeaways from all of this so far? What stood out to you the most?
Honestly, what really hits me is how the whole debate about those migrant minors shows how Spain, and really the whole of Europe, is struggling to balance humanitarian ideals with political realities.
It's a tough balance to strike.
For sure. And I'm really interested to see how this plays out in the long term.
Me too. But we'll have to save that for part 2.
You got it? See you then.
Looking forward to it. Yeah, it really is a balancing act for the PSOE.
It's high stakes, too. And you mentioned how the PP are using this to their advantage. What are they actually doing to gain ground here?
Well, they're really pushing this narrative that the PSOE are just incompetent, basically.
Okay.
That they're not fit to lead. That they're putting political deals ahead of the needs of Spanish citizens.
So classic opposition tactics.
Exactly. They're hammering home the message that the PSOE can't protect Spain's borders, and they're not managing resources properly.
It sounds like they're playing on people's fears about migration.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a tactic that works, unfortunately.
But what about those Catalan separatist parties, Junts and ERC? It seems like they're playing their own game here.
Oh, totally. For them, it's not just about migration. It's about pushing their own agenda for Catalan autonomy.
Right. So they're using their position in the coalition to get what they want from the PSOE.
It's exactly. More control over resources, symbolic gestures that support their independence movement, things like that.
So basically, they're using this migrant crisis as leverage.
Pretty much. Which does raise some ethical questions.
Yeah, it feels like the needs of those kids are getting lost in the middle of all this political maneuvering.
It's a valid concern. And it's a dilemma a lot of countries face. How do you balance national interests with the need to help people who are suffering?
It's a tough one for sure. And it makes you wonder what the long-term impact of Catalonia only accepting so few minors will be.
Right. Will it just create more tension between Catalonia and the rest of Spain? Will people see it as Catalonia shirking their responsibility?
It's almost like a microcosm of the problems facing the whole EU.
Yeah, with regions wanting more autonomy and national governments trying to keep everyone together.
It's a tough balancing act for sure. But I want to get back to that Pablo Ecanit case.
Oh, right, the tweet.
It really gets to the heart of some fundamental issues about free speech in this digital age.
It does. It's a great case study in how social media is changing the rules of the game and how the law is struggling to keep up.
What I found interesting was that the case actually went to trial, even though the prosecutor tried to dismiss it.
Right. What do you think that says about how the Spanish legal system views hate speech online?
It seems like they're taking a pretty hard line.
Yeah, even when it's dressed up with statistics and arguments about public safety.
So they're saying that online speech, especially from people with a platform, can have real consequences.
And that it can incite violence or discrimination.
So it's not just about what you say, but also who you are and how many people are listening.
Exactly. The context is so important.
And the court seems to be saying that people like Echenique, with his background and his following, have a responsibility to be careful about what they say.
To avoid language that could stir up hatred or prejudice.
That's a tricky balance, isn't it?
It is. Protecting free speech, but also recognizing that words can be really harmful.
And this case could set a big precedent for how online speech is regulated, not just in Spain, but everywhere.
I think so too. It highlights the challenges that governments and courts are facing trying to apply old laws to this new world of online communication.
Okay, let's switch gears for a moment and talk about the economy. Specifically, that tourism boom that Spain is experiencing.
Right. It's a bright spot in all of this.
It is. But I'm curious about the potential downsides of all those tourists. What are your thoughts?
Well, the biggest concern is probably the strain on resources, especially in places that are already dealing with a lot of Migrants.
Right.
More pressure on infrastructure,
Yeah.
water supplies, energy consumption, waste management, all of that.
And that pressure is even greater in places like the Canary Islands, where tourism is such a huge part of the economy.
Yeah. So how do they balance the benefits of tourism with the need to be sustainable and protect their resources?
That's a tough question.
It is. The Spanish government knows they need to promote sustainable tourism. And there are some programs in place.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, there are initiatives to encourage hotels and other accommodations to be more eco-friendly.
Okay.
And they're trying to get tourists to use public transport more. And there are campaigns to educate tourists about things like water usage and waste disposal.
So trying to raise awareness.
Yeah. And they're also trying to diversify tourism a bit
How so?
by highlighting cultural and historical attractions,
Mhm.
not just the beaches and the sun.
So spread the impact out more evenly.
Exactly. So they're trying to be proactive,
Right.
but it's a constant challenge.
And it's going to require a lot of cooperation between the government, the tourism industry, and the local communities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's essential that they find a way to balance economic growth with environmental protection.
Otherwise, they're going to damage their natural resources and eventually kill the goose that laid the golden egg.
Right. And speaking of impacts, let's not forget about the potential social and cultural effects of all these tourists.
Could it lead to tension with local communities?
It's definitely a risk, especially if residents feel like they're being pushed out or that their culture is being deleted.
We've already seen some pushback in some areas, haven't we?
We have people complaining about overcrowding, noise pollution, that kind of thing.
So how do you address that? How do you make tourism work for everyone?
It's tough, but I think the key is to involve local communities in the planning process from the beginning.
Give them a voice.
Exactly. Listen to their concerns and make sure they're benefiting from tourism in a way that feels fair and sustainable.
So it's about creating a more inclusive and participatory approach to tourism.
Right, one that considers the needs of everyone involved.
And recognizing that tourism isn't just about money. It's a social and cultural phenomenon that can have a big impact on the places and people involved.
For sure. And finding a way to manage that impact responsibly is crucial for everyone.
Okay, so let's bring it back to the political landscape and those unaccompanied minors. We've talked about the PSOE, the PP, and the Catalan parties. But what about the kids themselves? What are their lives actually like?
Well, it's important to remember that these young people have already been through a lot,
They've had to leave their homes and families behind.
often in very dangerous circumstances.
And then when they get to Spain, they're faced with a whole new set of challenges.
Right, like language barriers, cultural differences, finding a place to live, accessing education and healthcare.
And on top of all that, the emotional trauma of being separated from loved ones and the uncertainty of the future.
It's a lot for anyone, let alone a child, to deal with.
So what's being done to help them? What kind of support is available?
Well, there are a number of organizations, both government and non-government, that are working to help these kids.
Okay.
They offer things like legal aid, social work, psychological support language classes, job training.
So a whole range of services.
Yeah. The aim is to provide a holistic approach to care, addressing both their immediate needs and their long-term well-being.
But it sounds like there are still a lot of challenges.
There are. Resources are often limited, and the quality of care can vary depending on where you are.
And of course, all those political debates we talked about don't help.
Right? Sometimes it feels like the human side of the story gets lost in all the politics.
It's important to remember that behind all the maneuvering and the policy discussions, there are real people whose lives are being affected by these decisions.
Absolutely. And we need to keep their voices and their experiences at the forefront of these conversations.
Well said. All right, we've covered a lot of ground today, from political strategy to legal issues, economic concerns, and the human impact of migration.
It's been a fascinating discussion.
It has. So for you listening, I want to leave you with this thought. What stood out to you the most in our conversation? What are your thoughts on the complexities we've uncovered? It really makes you think, doesn't it? All these different aspects of the issue and how they're all connected.
Yeah, it's been a really insightful discussion, I think.
It has for me, too. You know, thinking about Spain's approach to migration and especially those unaccompanied minors, what do you think this tells us about the bigger picture in Europe? What's your take on that?
Well, I think it really highlights the fact that there's no real unified strategy across the EU on this issue.
Right, so each country is kind of doing its own thing.
Pretty much, which leads to all sorts of inconsistencies and makes it really hard to feel like there's a sense of shared responsibility. You know?
So it's like everyone's just trying to figure it out on their own instead of working together.
Exactly. And that makes it way harder to address the root causes of migration in the first place.
Right, because If countries can't even agree on how to manage the flow of people, how are they going to tackle the reasons why people are leaving their homes in the first place?
Exactly. We're talking poverty, conflict, climate change. These are huge global issues.
And they're not going away anytime soon.
Not at all. So this is a challenge that's only going to get bigger and more complex.
Which makes me wonder how all this pressure might change Spain's role within the EU. Do you think they might become more isolationist, or could they actually step up and become a leader in pushing for more humane and collaborative migration policies?
That's a really interesting question. It's hard to say for sure, but I do think Spain is at a crucial point right now.
Like a crossroads.
Exactly. The way they handle this situation could have a big impact, not just on their own politics, but on their relationships with other European countries and their whole standing within the EU.
So big implications.
Definitely.
What if they decide to prioritize their own interests above everything else? Could that lead to even more fragmentation within the EU when it comes to migration?
It could, and I think that would be a really worrying development because it would make it even tougher to find common ground and come up with effective solutions.
Right. It would just exacerbate the problem.
Exactly. But on the other hand, if Spain chooses to take a more compassionate and collaborative approach, it could be really inspiring for other countries.
Like a positive ripple effect.
Exactly. It could encourage other EU members to step up and do more.
So there's potential for both good and bad outcomes depending on what path Spain takes.
Absolutely. And a lot of it comes down to public perception, too.
Right. How do people feel about the way the government is handling this?
If people feel like the government is losing control or not protecting their interests, it could lead to a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment and give more power to those populist movements.
Which is something we've seen happen in other European countries.
Unfortunately, yes. When people are afraid or uncertain about the future, they're more likely to fall for simplistic solutions or blame outsiders for their problems.
So it's more important than ever to have these complex and nuanced conversations about migration.
I agree. We need to challenge those simplistic narratives and really focus on finding solutions that are both effective and humane.
Right, so it's about moving away from fear and towards a more empathetic and compassionate understanding of the situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We need to see migrants not as a threat,
Yeah.
but as individuals with their own stories and aspirations, people who have something to offer.
And it's important to remember that migration isn't some new phenomenon.
Right. It's been a part of human history forever.
People have always moved around in search of a better life or safety or just a fresh start.
Exactly. The challenge we face today is how to manage those movements in a way that works for everyone.
So how do we do that?
Well, it requires cooperation, both within and between countries.
Working together.
Exactly. We need to be willing to share responsibility, to invest in finding solutions, and to build a world where everyone has a chance to thrive.
That's a powerful vision and a great point to end on, I think.
I think so too.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm really struck by just how much there is to learn and think about when it comes to this issue.
It's definitely complex and multifaceted,
And it's constantly changing.
which is why it's so important to stay informed and engaged.
Absolutely. So for our listeners out there, I want to leave you with a final thought. Think about all the connections we've explored today, the politics, the economics, the social anxieties, and the human stories. How do those connections play out in your own community, in your own country, and in the world as a whole? And what role do you want to play in shaping a more just and compassionate response to the challenges of migration?
It's a conversation that needs to keep happening, and one that requires all of us to participate with empathy, critical thinking, and a willingness to learn from each other.
Because at the end of the day, we're all part of this interconnected world, and the choices we make today will have consequences for generations to come.
That's a really important point to remember.
It is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Spanish politics and migration.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you found it insightful and that it sparked your curiosity to learn more about these crucial issues.
Absolutely. Keep exploring and keep asking questions.
That's what it's all about. Thanks for listening.